Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be joined by Dr. Mysha Clarke. She's a natural resource social scientist, and her aim is to better understand people's environmental decision making and to determine avenues through which to connect people with natural resource conservation and management. Her collaborative and interdisciplinary research projects include invasive plant management on private non-industrial family forest lands, communication of invasive insects in the media, urban garden connectivity, and urban forest change over time. Overall, she envisions her research contributing theories and knowledge to improve socio-ecological interactions, environmental decision-making, and conservation by focusing primarily on the human dimensions of forest management and other natural resources. She's an assistant professor at the University of Florida in the School of Forest Resources and Conservation. And I had the great pleasure of getting to know Dr. Clarke through a grant proposal we were working on. And, just really interesting work. I know that your graduate work was kind of up in this neck of the woods. And so a lot of implications for us, as well as your ongoing work there in Florida. So thank you so much for joining us today. Really looking forward to your seminar.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me. And for all of you joining, thanks for joining. I'm happy to respond to any questions or thoughts that you may have about this project. So we recently wrapped up this project, maybe in the last month. And so I will present from one of the sections from that project. Okay, there we go. All right, so I will go ahead and start sharing my screen.
Wonderful. And just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat and I will raise those for you. Or you can unmute yourself and ask. I do ask that you do that, hold that until the end of the seminar.
Thank you, Ellen. All right, so as Ellen mentioned earlier, I am an assistant professor at UF. I started in January of last year, so just finished my first year. And recently our school actually changed names. So we are now School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences. We had the name changing ceremony last week. And so that will be a whole roll around for the media and in branding and changing our name to be more inclusive of these other natural resource fields within our school. So I will focus on some of the work that was done in Indiana, looking at family forest landowners and invasive plant management. And I've done other work looking at invasive species in urban areas and communication and media. And so I'm happy to respond to those, but for this particular talk, we'll focus on family forest landowners. So I'll go into some background about community-led invasive plant management, then looking at what is the role of social influence and collective efficacy beliefs on family forest owners' perceptions and cooperative actions regarding invasive plant management, and then end with some big takeaways from this part of the project. So this project was possible through some really amazing collaborators. So my former PhD advisor, Dr. Ma, is a professor at Purdue University. I also worked with Drs. Kristen Flores and Snyder at the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station, and Dr. Hennes in the Department of Psychological Sciences. Hence, there are these different types of social psychology theories that are included in this project overall. And so this project was funded by Purdue University as well as the USDA Forest Service. In addition to that, also funded by the Center for the Environment at Purdue University and the Purdue Ag Seed Program. And of course, for a project that has different dimensions, there are many people who contributed, including other grad students who were really helpful, as well as extension agents in helping to establish those connections with the project, give feedback throughout the entire phase. So just wanted to extend a huge thank you to those people before delving into the project. So here is a list of some of the publications that came from this, and the last two were just accepted this past month and in February. And so this is just a list of some of the peer-reviewed journal articles rather that came out of this work if you're interested in reading more about the other sections. And I'll have that at the end of the slide as well. So some background about invasive plant management on family forest lands. So invasive plant management is a landscape level issue on family forest lands. However, majority of publications on invasive species management has focused on ecological sciences. So this review paper, for example, that was done looking at articles published between 1980 and 2013, found that about 1% of articles published about invasive species focused on social sciences, and the others focus on ecological sciences or other types of sciences. And so that creates a need to study invasive plant management and invasive species, right, using a social science perspective. So as we talk about invasive plants, it's also important to define what invasive plants are. So just so we're all on the same page, we also use this definition on the cover of our survey questionnaire, which I'll talk about a bit later. And so we defined invasive plants as species that are introduced deliberately or unintentionally outside their natural habitats where they can establish, spread, sometimes crowd out native vegetation and the wildlife that feeds on it, and even change ecosystem processes. Invasive plants may have economic or environmental impacts on your wooded land. And so this is not the verbatim definition used by the USDA, but it was somewhat adapted, right, to better fit our survey and for landowners to get on the same page about what we're referring to when we talk about invasive plants throughout the survey. Invasive plants are known for having various social and ecological impacts. So for example, ecologically, they can displace native species, reduce native wildlife habitat. And so this photo is a photo I took while I was in Indiana, and it shows garlic mustard along the roadway. And studies have shown that invasive plants, right, for example, garlic mustard tends to be more common along disturbed areas, for example, shown here along this roadway. And so overall, they can, as you can see, take over various areas. If they're left untreated, they can degrade recreational areas and reduce the health and productivity of forest ecosystems, depending on the species. They also have different types of socioeconomic impacts. For example, it's estimated that invasive species cost about $137 billion annually in damages in the US, and also have different types of public health impacts. For example, may increase skin toxins or different types of irritants, and may also threaten human security and well-being. Globally, it also has significant impacts. And this map here shows different levels of vulnerability to the threat of invasive species. And we can see, for example, in this yellow circle, parts of the Midwest and Indiana that have red shading, meaning it has very high threats from invasive species. Likewise, in terms of just the forest plots themselves, right, we also see, well, this map is showing different types of invasion by subplots based on FIA data. And so the areas that are in orange to red shows between 56 to 100% of those subplots are invaded. And so we can see different parts of Indiana that has a lot of subplots that are invaded for the forested areas. And so invasive species overall creates different types of threats on the landscape. And so it is important to focus on family forest landowners because they own the majority of lands in the US cumulatively. So 36% of forest lands in the US are owned by around 10.4 million families and individuals. Particularly for Indiana, around 75% of forest lands are privately owned. So it's even more important to include them in certain states like Indiana, where such a huge percentage of the forest lands are owned by private families and individuals. In addition to that, around over 82% of invasive plants are introduced through the horticultural industry. And that creates a problem because some of those plants are still not heavily regulated, and so they're still being sold in different types of plant stores or nurseries or big box stores. And so that creates this continual introduction of invasive plants on the landscape through different types of individuals or landowners who may or may not be aware of those impacts. Again, there's also increasing but still limited regulations on invasive plants overall, especially for terrestrial systems. And studies have shown that family forest landowners know relatively little and may have varied perceptions about the socio-ecological impacts of invasive plants. And we also found similar in our study, where some landowners may believe invasive plants create negative impacts while others don't think so, and some are still unclear. And overall, as I mentioned earlier, right, a review article showed that there's not a lot of social science research being done about invasive species management. And while this is growing, right, there's still a need to better understand it, especially with regards to private family forest landowners. And so this project was created to help address some of those gaps. So as we think about family forest landowners and working together, right, it's really important to think about it in terms of a community, mostly because the landownership is large. So again, over 10 million families and individuals that collectively own these plots. And across the US and in Indiana, over 3 million acres owned by family holdings. And so as we think about it, right, this figure from McPatchen, Neal, and Wildland shows an example of a plot, right? So the black box in the middle is a theoretical area that's invaded by invasive plants, right? The areas that are in the gray shows areas that may be invaded later. And then the lighter dotted gray shows areas close to that may also be invaded. So you can think about it as having this ripple effect in terms of how invasive species spread. And so if you think about it on the landscape, you could also picture it as individual family plots, right? And so if one landowner, for example, in the middle decides not to manage, and that creates the source of that invasion, right? That landowner intentionally or unintentionally creates additional costs on their neighbors if their neighbors are really concerned about invasives and decide to manage. And so invasive species is an interesting collective action problem, right? Because of this sort of social dilemma where landowners indirectly impact others by either removing invasives or not, right? Thereby increasing the spread or reducing the spread based on their actions and whether or not they manage. And so this can be problematic for various reasons, and our research brought us some of that, right, in terms of the social dilemma that landowners also experience themselves, whether or not they're the ones spreading it or the ones having to deal with their neighbors' source of invasion. And so for this project, we use what is referred to as community-led collective action. And community-led collective action is looking at landowners working with their neighbors to remove invasive plants from both of their property. It usually involves landowners supporting and coordinating with each other, but without external leadership. So for example, external leadership like extension agencies or other types of nonprofit organizations that work with landowners could help, right? But they're not the ones necessarily spearheading it, but more could be like a facilitator in that sort of role. So at least from the community-led perspective, it is led by the community or by landowners wanting to work with each other. So previous research about this shows that landowners are more likely to control invasive plants when they identify biodiversity and wildlife protection as part of their reasons for owning their land. If they see invasive plants as a threat to their forest, whether that's a threat to the productivity of their timber production or a threat to the biodiversity or water quality or recreational activities. Also, landowners are more likely to control invasive plants if they have some sort of reaction to social norms. So are they influenced by their neighbors? If yes, then they're more likely to engage in invasive plant management. Also, landowners are motivated by what their peers do or expected norms of behavior, and we also found the same in our work. And landowners are more likely to manage if they believe the money and time required to remove them is worth it in the end. So again, back to the subplots, right? If a landowner notices that, well, this neighbor over here has all these invasive plants and I keep putting money and time into it, right? It's not gonna work because it keeps crossing the fence, then they're less likely to continue managing, right? Thereby increasing this ripple problem. And so to collect data, we had two main phases. So the first phase, we did semi-structured face-to-face interviews with forestry professionals and family forest landowners. So those semi-structured interviews helped us to better identify what are some of the underground issues, better understand the context of what landowners and professionals that work with landowners are seeing. And then based on those interviews, we conducted a statewide mail survey. And with our survey, we contacted 2,600 family forest landowners throughout the state that were randomly selected. And with that, we also use what is known as the 5-wave Dillman method. So the 5-wave Dillman method is a classic, I guess, survey method where you basically have 5 different ways of contacting a respondent. So the first wave is usually, for example, a postcard where you'll tell the landowner, the survey is being conducted by Purdue University to study XYZ. And so the first wave, we sent a postcard to let them know that we're doing the survey and they should expect the survey in the next 3 days. The second wave, or second contact, we send them the actual survey with a $2 bill. If you've ever seen just a hard $2 bill, right? We send that as a token of appreciation to landowners along with the actual survey. We also used a pre-stamped return envelope, so landowners didn't have to pay to get a stamp and send it back to us. Really, they just had to fill out the survey and then it was already prepaid for them and they put it in the mailbox. So we reached out to landowners 5 different times, right? Meaning kept track of who responded when. So it's very labor intensive. And so I appreciate all the other students who were really helpful in making sure we check the mail every day, sometimes multiple times per day, check off the names and numbers of all the landowners who responded and reaching out to the ones who haven't. And so at the end of the 5-wave, our response rate was 58.7%. And that gave us around 1,400 usable responses, which we're pretty happy with, considering struggles with survey research sometimes. And so this will report a mix of both the interviews and survey information, but mostly focus on the survey and using the interviews to better explain why we got some of the responses that we did. So we found that of the landowners that completed our survey, the average size of their land was around 82 acres and ownership was between 1 to 7 people. Most of them were owned by 2 owners. So in many cases, a couple, so 52%. 30% of them said that they were absentee owners, meaning they lived more than a mile away from their forest land. And so with absentee ownership, different studies have different theories about how they manage or may not manage their forest land. And so with invasive species management, it is also interesting to note, right, that some studies say that some landowners who are absentee are less likely to manage or not put in as much effort, right? But our study did not find a significant impact of whether or not they live close to their land. We also found that 73% of landowners said that their woodland was currently or previously part of a farm, which again goes back to issues with disturbance on the landscape and potentially spreading invasive species. And then only 21% said they had a written management plan, which is actually higher than the national average for family forest landowners. So the national average for family forest landowners who own a written management plan is only at 13%. And so this was very interesting to find. But overall, our other demographic data is fairly similar actually with the national average that's conducted by the National Woodland Owner Survey. And the average age is 63 years old. So most landowners own their land to enjoy beauty or scenery. So that's the highest selected there, 78% of landowners selected that. And also among the top was also to protect or improve wildlife habitat, protect nature and biological diversity, to pass land to children for privacy and to protect water resources. So many of these are really amenity reasons or non-extractable reasons for owning their woodland. And then at the bottom, we see other things like for part of a vacation home or for firewood or timber products like logs or pulpwood. So what are some things that we found? So one of the key takeaways based on our findings is that landowners are interested in working collectively to manage invasive plants, but they don't really know how to do so. They're also fairly familiar with invasives, and so we found that most landowners expressed some level of familiarity. So they were either between moderately familiar or very familiar with invasive plants. And with this particular question, we did give them a rank definition. And so we asked them familiarity. And so, for example, very familiar would say something like, are able to identify all invasive plants on my property, or something like that. Then familiar would say, able to identify 75% of invasives. So we did try to give them a more specific wording to identify familiarity with this case. We also wanted to know if they were confident in their abilities to manage invasive plants. And this is important because other studies have shown that people are more likely to work together if they feel like they're confident in whatever action they're supposed to do. So we found it interesting that landowners, 49% of them, said that they had little or no confidence in their abilities to remove invasive plants. So the green bars show removing invasive plants, and the orange shows prevent invasive plants. And then a higher percentage, 59%, said that they had little or no confidence in their abilities to prevent invasive plants, which for some landowners also released their interviews seem more abstract in terms of how can I prevent them from coming on my property, right? It's much easier to conceive of how they could remove them once they are already established. And so some of the barriers that landowners express to managing invasive plants, and these are some questions we asked them if they had enough knowledge or money or other resources. And so 82% of them selected that they did not have enough knowledge about county, state, or federal programs that could help landowners like themselves remove invasive plants. Likewise, 69% of them said that they did not have enough knowledge to prevent or remove invasive plants, and 64% said they did not have enough money. And so with this interesting finding, there is also another part of the survey which wanted to look at what are their plans for the future. And so 82% of them said they didn't have enough knowledge about programs to help them, but 74% of them said that they are unlikely to participate in any programs. And so this could be because, well, maybe they just don't know about the programs, or really they just are not interested in the programs that are available. 69% said they didn't have enough knowledge, but 79% said they're unsure or unlikely to participate in different types of workshops or information sessions about invasive plants. And 53% said they're unsure or unlikely to search for information on the internet about invasives. Likewise, in terms of lack of money, 82% of them said they're also unlikely or unsure about applying for different types of financial assistance from federal or state programs to help them remove invasive plants. So Indiana has a few state programs that help landowners remove invasives based on an application basis. And so we found this to be very interesting, comparing what are some of the struggles, but also the plans for the future. And so as we think about invasives, again, back to the bigger question of working together because of the collective impacts of invasives on the landscape, we wanted to know, well, are landowners willing to work with their neighbors to manage invasive plants? And so part of this is looking at their concern, right? Because previous studies have shown that if landowners think invasive plants are a threat, they're more likely to do something. And so the green bars here shows level of concern on their own private land. Then the orange bars shows their level of concern on their neighbors or nearby lands. And so 77% of landowners say that they're concerned about invasives on their own land, and 68% say they're concerned about invasives on their neighbor's property. And so this is from our interview with a family forest landowner. And this landowner said, my husband and I were walking around our property this morning, and I was complaining about the amount of multi-flower rows that we had. I was complaining because we had to start working on it again after I have already worked on it before. As we were walking along our fence line, we noticed our neighbor's property is full of multi-flower rows. And my husband made a good point, which I already knew, which is that it doesn't do us any good because we have a seed source right there. And so back to this question of concern, right? We see landowners indicate that they're concerned. And this is one of the quotes that sort of explain what they were saying, right? Going back to the chart from earlier in the presentation, right? Looking at the seed sources and the impacts on landowners' future behavior with regards to management. And so we also wanted to know if landowners even thought this was important. Do they think that to remove invasive plants effectively requires them to work together? And most landowners said that they agree with the statement. So 53% of them said that they agree that for it to be removed or controlled effectively, landowners have to work together. And 14% said they strongly agreed, while 28% said that they were undecided or didn't know. And so, for example, another comment to support this from the interview with a forestry professional said that most people just go about it on their own, but successful people that understand that there are people out there who do this work professionally, and we're happy to partner with these people and help them apply for funding. We're happy to do that, but I think a lot of the places where we work, people are very isolated and have sort of a pioneer mentality where they don't want people on their land, and they put signs up saying that they will shoot you. They're super guarded, and that's an issue for sure. And so we found it interesting, right, back to this graph, that so many landowners, right, either agreed or strongly agreed that they should work together for it to be effective. But on the ground, right, sometimes it sends a different message to professionals or other landowners, right, in terms of working together. And so in exploring this idea of working together, we asked landowners a series of questions and asked them to indicate how much they strongly agree or disagree, how much they agree or disagree with the following statements. And so this report here shows their percentages for strongly agree or disagree. And so 69% of landowners strongly agreed or agreed with the statement that a good woodland owner should control or remove invasive plants from their property to reduce potential spread onto their neighbor's property. Likewise, 71% strongly agreed that if their neighbors are controlling or removing invasive plants, they will feel the need to do the same. Right back to some of the comments from our interviews. And also 63% said that if their family or friends are controlling or removing invasive plants, that they will also feel the need to do the same. Right, so looking at this social influence from friends or family, right, who are managing and how it may impact their own behavior and their likelihood to manage in the future. Also at the bottom here, it's very interesting to note that landowners agreed at the very last bottom that it is difficult for woodland owners to self-organize and cooperate with one another on their own. So there's, I guess, this mismatch between what they think a good woodland owner should be, but also how to get there in terms of landowners working together. And so this paper was recently accepted, right? And so I'm happy to share that link with you if you'd like to read it in more detail. So again, social norms, going back to what some other studies have found, or strong influence on landowners' behavior and likelihood to manage in the future. So for example, a comment from an interviewee said, a family forest landowner interviewee said that freedom is limited when it infringes on the rights of others. Anything can become an invasive, good or bad. We can't mandate to people what to do if it is not financially feasible. The more we can do without legislation and be independently responsible for, the better backbone we have and the more we get accomplished, right? So a very interesting comment looking at really people's freedom or privacy to do what they want on their property, but also recognizing that it creates a social dilemma for other people not on their property, right? Because of the nature of invasive species spread. And so back to connecting it with landowners' behavior, we wanted to know, well, what have you done that you could address working with your neighbors in the past? And so we asked them a series of questions to address what they've done in the past 5 years. So we asked them if they have talked to other woodland owners about invasive plants. Only 4% of them said they did. Only 8% said they have talked to their neighbors, their neighboring woodland owners. 14% said they talked to family about invasives, and only 2% said that they worked with their neighbors to remove invasive plants. So we see this, again, this mismatch between the interest in working with each other, but on the ground, it's almost the complete opposite, in the sense that only 2% have ever actually worked with their neighbors, but they also acknowledge that it is really difficult to do. And so last few slides here. And so to support this, a family forest landowner said that in theory, working cooperatively would be better, but in reality, if I waited until my neighbor decided to cooperate with me, nothing would get done. So I just go about it on my own. But if I had a neighbor who expressed any interest and could afford it and were willing to cooperate, then certainly. But certainly it is not going to happen in my neighborhood or many neighborhoods. And likewise, a professional experienced similar sentiments, saying, I don't know if the ideology here in Indiana is ready for cooperatives. They're a pretty independent, individualistic group of people. And so we wanted to see what were some of the significant factors that could influence landowners' likelihood to engage in collective action. And so we did a logistic regression model looking at some of the factors that previous research have found to be important with regard to collective action and also invasive plant management overall. So for example, some studies have shown that landowners that have a bigger size of land are more likely to manage than landowners with smaller acreage. And so these are some of the factors we put in, again, based on what previous literature has found to be important and some of the social psychology theories that we used to prioritize the study. And so with some of these different variables, we found that the ones that were statistically significant included if they had concerns about invasive plants on their neighbor's land, if they felt confident in their abilities to remove invasive plants, if they have worked with their neighbors in the past, and if they really acknowledge this need to work together, and if they were influenced by social norms. So some of this, again, reaffirming what previous studies have shown, but also looking at some other types of behavior, like for example, past experience with working with each other. And so the overall takeaway from this is that yes, landowners are willing to work with their neighbors to manage invasive plants, but they need some additional help to facilitate that process. And so some concluding thoughts from this is that family forest landowners recognize the challenges to management, but at the same time don't intend to participate in already established programs at the federal, state, or even local levels. And our survey did not dig deeper into this, but it could be maybe because they didn't know about it before the survey, or maybe they're generally just not interested in the programs that are already there. In addition to that, we found it interesting that landowners think, well, if their neighbors control invasive plants, it's considered them being a good neighbor, right? But at the same time, they don't want to be intrusive and invade on their neighbors' privacy and ask them to work together or even control invasives on their own. But it's one of those things that they think makes them a good neighbor. In addition to that, landowners also found that their confidence or self-efficacy is important. So basically, that could look like boosting their confidence in moving invasive plants, whether that's through demonstrations or other types of information, so they feel confident in their abilities. But also it's complicated, right? Because they may be applying the correct methods, but again, if their neighbors have a source of invasion, right, that sort of becomes impossible to completely eradicate, even if they're doing exactly what they should be doing. It's also important to raise awareness about different programs available at the state and local levels. Over 80% of our respondents said they were not aware of those programs. And in addition to that, landowners care about what their neighbors are doing. Even if they're not knocking on their neighbor's door, talking to them directly, they do care and they do pay attention or feel concerned about what's happening on their neighbor's forest land, especially in regards to invasives. And then the final recommendation is to look at the factors that may motivate landowners. For example, thinking about revising different types of landowner outreach and participation. So to my knowledge, most of the invasive plant management activities focus on individual management, right? So someone may do a forest inventory on an individual forest landowner's property. So it suggested that maybe that should be done more at the community level or with 3 neighbors, right? Instead of this individual independent focus, especially with invasive species, it might be more feasible, right, to focus it on a group of neighbors so that becomes more normalized as we work together, right, at this landscape scale to address some of these issues rather than just individual plots or inventories and recommendations. All right, thank you so much for listening. And here's a list of some of the work that came from this project, and I'm happy to respond to any questions.